Welcome, Mr. Ovais. Sarmad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and good afternoon to everybody who's there in person and to those who are joined online. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I'd like to at the outset thank Her Royal Highness, the President of Jigme Singhi Wangchuk School of Law, for inviting me in particular, to share some perspective on the topic that is under discussion. And I would like to also acknowledge and appreciate the presentation we just heard from Professor Matthew Peterson. It was very engaging. I won't have that kind of animated discussion, but we'll share some overall perspective on where we are with regard to climate change issues that we are facing and what we are doing to address it. Distinguished delegates, again, I'm terribly sorry I couldn't be there. I was planning to be there, but as it often happens, unexpected events, and that prevented me from traveling. So here we are in Bonn at the headquarters of UNFCCC, and it's a great pleasure to address all of you. Although this session is about politics of climate change, we at the UN, as you all know, take a non-political approach and work with all stakeholders. And in that regard, I'm pleased to share my perspective on the importance of what we refer to as inclusive multilateralism, which goes beyond politics. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But let me share with you the overall context where we are at this stage. It is very clear that every fraction of a degree of temperature rise is a matter of life and death to millions of people. The loss of life and livelihood is devastating in many countries, as we are seeing every day on our TV screens or reporting in both the mainstream and social media, and especially the most vulnerable people in the developing world. And we have also taken note that the last 7 years have been the hottest on record in many parts of the world, according to the World Meteorological Organization. And as of now, the global temperature has already crossed 1.1 degrees Celsius. And this is in relation to what the Paris Agreement has set as a limit, not a target, but a limit of 2 degrees or preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century. So, despite the recent geopolitical challenges, climate change remains the threat to humanity in the medium to long term, acting both as a risk multiplier and as a mega trend. And should the climate emergency not be addressed rapidly and at scale, all progress that has been made so far in many development areas, in health, peace, food security, and the list goes on, will unfortunately regress. However, climate change also acts as a driver for systems transformation towards sustainable living, increasing awareness and recognition of the need for such a shift. And that's what we are focusing on, to get all stakeholders, and especially the governments and the private sector, to make that transformational shift and change in the way we live and consume resources. And we also recognize that the governments and the nations cannot do this system-wide transformation on their own. Businesses, academia, such as the Jigme Singhi Wangchuk School of Law, and civil society, they all need to work together in a spirit of, as I repeat, inclusive multilateralism. Because only through collaboration it is possible to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, as stated in the Paris Agreement. It is also crucial to take climate action now, here and now, because we are facing those impacts now. And climate action means addressing the impacts of human-made climate change, as we already heard from Professor Peterson, that and it affects all sectors of our society, including everything, day-to-day lives and livelihoods of all of us. What we need to do is to reduce the severity of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's as simple as it gets. Of course, there are much more complex scenarios that support that, but in simplistic terms, that's what we need to do. And also at the same time to strengthen our resilience, reduce our exposure and adapt to the effects of climate change, including climate hazards. And that can go a long way, but there are limits to that as well. These crucial steps are outlined in one of our core treaties, of which we are the custodians, and that is Paris Agreement, and before that it was Kyoto Protocol and the Convention. But the Paris Agreement is extremely important. That was adopted in 2015, but with a near universal participation and adoption. The central aim of Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to the threats of climate change in the context of sustainable development of SDGs, as you all know, and foster a sustainable living for the planet. And that is to do with limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5. And we in the UN Climate Secretariat are actively supporting the governments and non-state actors worldwide to depoliticize the discourse on climate change and help develop climate responsive policies across the board. The international treaties agreed by countries upon during the meetings of the UN climate change, which are referred to as COPs, they are based on consensus and they have accountability that cross-cuts. So the governments and nations are accountable to each other in fulfilling their pledges and are also accountable to their civil society and to the populations and to the citizens of the countries they represent, and who oftentimes scrutinize their action. And that, as we see in the civil society, the youth movement is getting louder and clearer. Coming back to the topic of the session, as I mentioned earlier, we in the United Nations and UN Secretariat for Climate Change work across and beyond the political dynamics of the countries, the geopolitical issues that are facing the world. And this is evidenced also at the annual conferences of COPs. A good example, especially from the last two COPs, is even with the tensions that we see between certain countries, such as the United States or China, for instance, those countries set aside their geopolitical differences and agreed to work jointly on addressing climate change and the impacts of climate change. So that is a powerful example of how climate change is also, in a way, becoming a unifying force to go beyond the politics. And in more specifically in the last year's COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, the outcomes were generally quite positive. There was a good package of decisions that reaffirmed the global commitment to promote a sustainable planet. It concluded with a breakthrough agreement to provide loss and damage, which has been in negotiations for a very long time. That is to do with providing funding to vulnerable countries hit hard by climate disasters and creating a specific fund for loss and damage. Now, let me also give you a brief perspective on looking ahead to COP28 this year in Dubai. And in Dubai, what COP28 is expected to deliver is first and foremost the global stocktake, to take stock of where the governments and countries and the state of climate is at this stage, so that based on that scientific evidence, correction trajectories can be made. What we also need to do is to make significant and credible progress on climate finance, including the delivery of $100 billion that has been promised, and the global goal on adaptation, because adaptation is extremely important. There is so much mitigation that can be done, but adaptation has to go hand in hand. And also, as I mentioned, the loss and damage that was agreed last year in COP27 will be fully operationalized now, or there is expectation that will be operationalized by COP28 later this year. And very importantly, to underpin all of that, there is just transition and also accountability of action by all stakeholders. So to conclude, I'll leave you with few reflections for you to ponder, and hopefully it'll help the discussion of this session and the forum. First is to protecting our planet requires a rapid systems transformation that can only happen if everyone is on board, working in a spirit of inclusive multilateralism. We must think beyond short-termism in the medium and long term, including each one of us, all of us in the conference here and beyond, have the means to shift the world to a more sustainable living through activism, changing the consumer behavior and raising awareness in our spheres of influence. Finally, third point is interconnectedness. Climate change is a risk multiplier, as I mentioned to you, but also a mega trend and a development accelerator in many areas of our lives. For a sustainable planet, therefore, it is crucial that we address climate change at the scale and as rapidly as we can. I once again take this opportunity to thank again Her Royal Highness for her and Bhutan's efforts to addressing the existential threat of climate change and for being a beacon of inspiration for us all. And I wish this forum great success, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes of this forum, and I wish you again all the very best. Thank you very much.